All right, guys, we are continuing in the book of Matthew. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 27. So if you have your Bibles, open it up there. We're going to be, as you saw, verse 27 starting off. If you don't have a Bible, feel free to grab one over there, our gift to you. And, of course, you can always download one in the App Store on your phone. We started in what's typically called the Passion narrative, which is sort of the trial and death of Jesus a few weeks ago. Last week, Matt led us through Jesus' trial before Pilate. You may remember that Pilate was sort of like trying to get Jesus off the hook. He could see that the Jewish leaders were acting out of jealousy, out of spite, and Pilate was trying to get Jesus free, but finally he capitulates to the people and says, okay, fine, if you want to kill him, I will kill him. Twist my rubber arm. And a little bit kind of ridiculous when you think about his job at holding justice. He gives up justice for expediency. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on, just break this into a couple chunks, and we're going to draw out some particular themes. One thing I want you to pay attention to is that Matthew's going to repeat this idea several times over of Jesus' kingship. And I'll go into this in a second, but I want you just to hear that in each section that we read. So looking at verse 27, this is what Matthew records. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns, and they set it on his head. They put his staff in his right hand, then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. And they said, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spit on him, they took the staff, and they struck him on the head again and again. And after they had mocked him, they took off the robe. They put on his own clothes, and then they led him away to crucify him. Matthew is going to use scenes like this. We're going to see this kind of repeated where the characters are going to state things about Jesus, and they're going to mock Jesus, and they're going to abuse Jesus. But each time, it's around this idea of his identity as the king. And Matthew is actually not just recording events here. He's drawing out this theme for us to understand that this isn't simply a mockery or an execution that's going on. This is Jesus' enthronement. And what Matthew wants us as readers to understand is what kind of king Jesus is. So I'm going to look at three ways that we can see Jesus' kingship. The first is a contrast. Jesus is the not Caesar king. When the governor's soldiers take Jesus out, they basically dress him up like Caesar. They don't look at like a Jewish picture of the king. They look at their vision of the king, which was Caesar. They put on a scarlet robe or a cape from one of the soldiers. They crush a crown of thorns on his head. If you're familiar with any kind of iconic Roman busts or pictures, Caesar had a laurel wreath, right? He had like the laurel wreath was the sign of his crown, and this is what they replicate in Jesus. The staff of Caesar's authority is a staff that they mockingly put in Jesus' hands. Even what they say, "Hail, King of the Jews," is a replica of what Caesar was demanding people would say to him, which is "Av Caesar, hail Caesar." But Jesus is a very different king than Caesar. And Matthew actually wants us to understand that. And so he juxtaposes using the imagery that these soldiers are using to mock Jesus to help us see that Jesus is a very different king than Caesar. And so I want us to pause for a second and actually think about that. Think about the difference between Jesus' kingship and the kingship of Caesar. How does Caesar bring about his vision of the kingdom? Some of you may be familiar with this, but in Roman times, there was this idea, which was the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. In fact, when Caesar Augustus was declared Caesar, if you go back and look at descriptions, it talks about him being like the one who brings about peace on earth. Well, who else says he's bringing peace on earth? Jesus. So how does Rome, how does Caesar bring about this vision of peace? He has the biggest, baddest army. And anyone who gets in his way gets crushed. That's how Rome maintained the peace. And we even see it in the scene that just took place before this. Rome will value expediency over justice. Pilate knows Jesus is innocent of the charges before him, but he doesn't want to break the peace, so he's willing to sacrifice an innocent person for the sake of maintaining the peace of Rome. The actions of Rome's subjects reveal, the actions of the subjects like Pilate reveal the character of Caesar, the way of Caesar. And I want to pause here for a second because I think I need to draw this out a little bit. In the Bible, oftentimes characters aren't just specific to a historical time or place. They're archetypes. They're there to help us understand something about the human condition. And so we don't even have a mention of who is Caesar in Jesus' time in the Bible. Because in many ways, Caesar is like Pharaoh. He's an archetype. He's a picture of what it looks like when humans, by their own rule and their own authority, lift themselves up. So let's continue and explore the way of Caesar. Caesar exploits others for his gain. Earlier in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is confronted about the temple tax. They're trying to trick him, and he actually says, pay your taxes to Caesar. But the reason it was a controversial thing is because provinces like Judea were getting gouged by the Roman Empire. All of that money was flowing back to Rome, where Rome was living large at the expense of everyone else. And then you think about that even at the individual level, where Caesar lives large at the expense of everyone else. The way of Caesar is one that exploits others for personal gain. And how does Caesar build his empire? How does he build his kingdom? Through conquest, through brutality, through power. And what is Caesar's self-image? His pride. He lifts himself up. Caesar is the man who declares himself to be a god. Now look at this picture of Jesus. What does this tell us about him? Well, unlike Caesar, who rules through fear, through power, through coercion, how does Jesus rule? He rules through service. Right? He said that earlier in Matthew's gospel. I came not to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. And while Caesar exploits for his own gain, Jesus sacrifices for the gain of others. He lays his life down. We see him right here as he prepares to go to the cross, humbly taking a beating that he did not deserve. And how does Jesus build his kingdom? Is it through conquest? Does he send out legions to go and attack and take over and subjugate? No. Jesus builds his kingdom through sacrifice, through love, through service, through laying down his life in such a way that others respond to him and are transformed by his Spirit and then do likewise. And ultimately, Jesus is the complete opposite of Caesar, who in pride lifts himself up as a god. Jesus is humbly the God who becomes a man. Do you guys see that difference of kingship? It's pretty stark when we actually look at it. But this begs a question for us. See, if there's two claims to kingship, Caesar and Jesus, then we need to ask ourselves, who do I follow? Whose servant am I? I think the way that we can tell that is our actions. Our actions reveal whose servant we are. Are we servants of Caesar, or are we servants of King Jesus? Do we look like Jesus, or do we look like Caesar? So I want to just pose for us before we move forward just a couple of questions to evaluate. And I want to invite us into this space just to simply ask, who do I look more like in my actions? Do I look more like Caesar, or do I look more like Jesus? The first question I want to ask is how do I lead others? How do I lead other people? Do I lead like Jesus, who humbly lays his life down? Or do I push to get my own way? This is true in so many aspects of our life. If you're a parent, it's so interesting. We have this task to discipline our kids, to teach them. And yet we can do that like Caesar, or we can do that like Jesus. So often I find myself in these spaces where I just want my kids to do what I want them to do. And I can threaten them. You're going to get a timeout if you don't do what I want. Paul Tripp wrote this phenomenal book. We saw it here in our bookstore. It's called Parenting, 14 Gospel Principles. And he actually talks about this, and he poses this question in the book. Whose kingdom are you trying to build as a parent? You see, if you're trying to build Jesus' kingdom, you might still want the same things for your kids. You might still need to offer discipline to your kids, but it's going to look different because you actually want them not just to do what you want, but you care about them learning to obey the heart of Jesus, and that's going to look different. When I want Isla or Ben, any of my kids, to do what I want, it's like, boom, do what I want or else. It's threat, it's power, it's boom. But when I want them to do what Jesus wants, when I actually want to serve them and see them grow, they might still get some discipline. But I'm going to sit with them. I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to wait until I'm in a place where I can actually love them and not respond out of anger or fear. Not fear. I'm not afraid of my kids. They are a little intense, but out of frustration. Kelly watches my kids, so she knows how scary they can be sometimes. I'm gonna respond out of grace. I'm gonna sit with my kids. I'm gonna talk to them. I'm gonna explain to them the heart of Jesus for them, why his authority for them actually is important. And you know what? It's weird. You can actually have these conversations with a 3-year-old. They might not get everything, but they're starting to build a picture of what Jesus is like. And it's a very different way of going about it. I can choose the way of Caesar. I can choose the way of Jesus. And this applies to every aspect of our life, right? You know, with the way that you interact with your spouse, the way that you interact with people who are under you in your job, the way that you interact with your friends, or, dare I say, the way that we interact in society. Will we go about it looking like Jesus? How do we lead others? Is it humbly? Is it servant-like? The second question I want to ask is, do I live a life that puts others first? Just ask yourselves. Look at how your life looks. I find that in a lot of times when I'm doing like counseling for marriages and things like that, that there's oftentimes like someone who's a giver in the relationship and someone who's a taker in the relationship. And that often works fine for a little while, but at a certain point, givers also want to receive, right? Is there any givers out there? Are you just used to like serving your spouse? You're really good at it, and yet, sometimes you're like, I'd really like someone to think about me. I think a question, and I'm a taker. I'm a total self-admitted. Like I will receive as much as Shannon wants to give. But I know that that's actually not the way of Jesus. So the way of Jesus is the God who gives of himself, who came again to serve, not to be served. How do we interact again in the other aspects of our life, in our job? I would even say this, for those of us who are watching online, for those of us who are here in this room this morning, how do we enter into our church environment? Do you know it's possible for us to enter into a church environment like Caesar, to say, hey, what is this going to do for me? I don't think I want to serve it because it's going to be inconvenient. I might have to miss a gathering. I might have to wake up early. I might have to stay a little bit later. And we see this in our community groups, right? Like, what is it going to do for me? Let me ask you, who does that sound more like? King Jesus or Caesar? Third question, how do I try and build my vision of the kingdom? Jesus built his kingdom by laying down his life sacrificially and then sending out his people to do likewise. So as we engage in our vision of the good life, and in our vision of the kingdom here on earth, does it look like the methods of Jesus? And I want to say this, and I want to say it very clearly. The ends do not justify the means. Rome had a vision of peace, but the way that they came about it was not the way of Jesus. It's possible for us to have a good picture of what life should be like, but to go about it in the wrong ways. So I want to invite us as we continue to ask, like, how do we build my vision of the kingdom? Does it look like the methods of Jesus? And finally, the last question I think we just should ponder is, do I seek to lift myself up? Am I like Caesar, the man who's trying to be God? Do I believe the world revolves around me, my wants, my desires, my rights? Or do I lay my life down? The second thing I want us to draw out about Jesus is that Jesus is not simply the not Caesar king, but he's a suffering king. Matthew continues on in verse 32, and he says, and as they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall. But after tasting it, he refused to drink it. And when they crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots and sitting down. They kept watch over him there. Above his head, they placed the written charge against him. Here we see it again. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Matthew doesn't want us to miss this moment of Jesus' kingship, enthronement upon the cross. And the picture that we get here after this beating that takes place is that he is called to carry his crossbeam for his cross forward. And Jesus is so depleted of strength at this point. Like we know previously he'd been scourged, which is like whipped. Then he's been beaten. So you can imagine like how weak his muscles must have been throbbing. He's dehydrated. So it's no wonder that they conscripted this guy who was just in the city walking around to carry Jesus' crossbeam for him. And then he gets to the spot where he's to be crucified, and they offer him something to drink. And just again, imagine how you would feel. Like Jesus is probably so dehydrated at this point. He's so thirsty, but they put gall in it. Like gall, like think gallbladder, like bile. Like it's going to be so disgusting, so bitter. So even in that, it's more additive to his suffering. No wonder he spits it out and says, yeah, I'm not touching that. Because it's going to have the opposite effect. Instead of quenching his thirst, it's going to make things so much worse. And then they put him on the cross. Now, there's been this movement, I think, in the last several years to focus in on the suffering, to focus in on the brutality. I mean, how many of you have seen The Passion of the Christ? Just like a brutal film depicting what is happening to Jesus. It almost glories in the brutality of it. But what's so interesting about Matthew is he actually doesn't do that. He describes the events, but he doesn't go into detail. And I believe it's because Matthew does not want us to miss the point in getting kind of caught up in the brutality of the moment, getting distracted by the physical suffering of Jesus. He doesn't want us to miss the point of what's really going on here. And so what Matthew does is he actually constructs this passage where he's showing echoes of several Psalms, but in particular Psalm 22, which is a psalm David wrote about a suffering king. And so we see these echoes. In verse 18 I'll just read some of the passages from the psalm for us, but in verse 18 it says, in Psalm 22, they divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. That's exactly what happens, right? Verse 35, when they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Later we'll see in verse 39, Matthew writes, those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads. The exact same language echoed from Psalm 22, verse 7, which says, that's not Psalm 22. Psalm 22, verse 7 says, all who see me mock me. They hurl their insults, shaking their heads. And then in verse 43, we read, this is the chief priests mocking Jesus. It says, he trusts in God. Let God rescue him if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. Echoing Psalm 22, verse 8, he trusts in the Lord. They said, let the Lord rescue him. Matthew wants to impose this, or Matthew's telling this story of Jesus with these echoes from Psalm 22 so we don't miss the point. The point is that this is Jesus' enthronement. This is what the King of Israel that God has promised actually looks like in this moment. He is a sufferer. He is the suffering king. So again, let me ask us, if this is the kind of king and we are claiming to be his followers, what does that mean for us? Well, let's look at the disciples. Did they go off to live rich lives filled with personal glory, personal fulfillment, satisfaction, and comfort? No. Right after the Gospels comes the book of Acts, and right from the very beginning, we see the disciples getting beaten, getting imprisoned. One of the early converts to Jesus, a man by the name of Paul, recounts the experiences he's had. He's gotten stoned. He's been beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked. He suffers. He actually goes on to talk about this. And I just want to read for us from Colossians. It's a church that he was writing to as he unpacks why this is the case. He says in chapter 1, verse 24, now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you. I rejoice in what I am suffering for you. And I fill up in my flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, which is the church. When I was sharing this passage with Shannon, she was like, wait. Is Paul saying there was something that Jesus did that was lacking? I was like, no. You're not getting it. This is what Paul is actually talking about. He goes on to say in verse 25, I have become a servant by the commission of God that God gave me to present to you the word of God in its fullness. The mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the Lord's people. To them, God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches and mystery which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. So what Paul is saying, he's not saying that Jesus' afflictions are insufficient for our salvation or that insufficient for paying the price for our sins. He's saying that they are limited in time and place, and for people to experience the gospel, it may cost us something. For the church to exist, it actually means we have to put our lives on the line. We have to be willing to suffer. We have to be the people of Jesus. The suffering king will have suffering servants. Phil Thompson, he's a PhD who was writing on this passage in Colossians, and he says, if you're stepping in and joining God in his mission to reclaim worshipers for himself, you will experience some measure of suffering or pain. That is what it means to join him in the spread of his gospel to the ends of the earth. This may be as simple as relational discomfort or the awkwardness of trying to share your faith. It may be as extreme as risking your life or moving your family to a place where few have heard the name of Jesus. The flip side is that if you are presently at your most comfortable, then it is possible that you haven't really joined God in his mission to advance the gospel. What Thompson is saying is, If you're presently at your most comfortable, it's possible that you're living under the kingship of Caesar and not the kingship of Jesus. Because the kingship of Jesus, the suffering king, he's going to produce followers that are willing to suffer for the sake of others. That are going to join him in his mission, that are going to go to whatever lengths it takes for other people to experience his love, his goodness. So what does your life tell you about whose servant you are? Now, as you hear this, there's a couple of ways that we can respond. One is to respond by just feeling like, I don't think I can be that kind of person. Like you're hearing this and you're like, I don't like suffering. I don't know that I can just lay down my life. Like that was Jesus. He was God. And I want to come to you in this place and say, you're actually right. See, if this is the kind of person that we have to be in order to be a servant of King Jesus, I think all of us fail at it. I know I do. I constantly put my own needs first. I constantly seek to get gain for myself. I constantly try and avoid suffering and pursue comfort. But there's still some good news, because the final thing we're going to see about Jesus' kingship is that Jesus is a saving king. Matthew writes in verse 38, 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it back in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." And in the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" And in the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him heaped insults upon him. Matthew, again, is using the irony of the insults to actually teach us the truths about who Jesus is. Jesus is crucified as a rebel leader, as an upstart king between 2 rebels, which is ironic because Jesus Barabbas, who Matt talked about last week, was actually a rebel. He was actually a rebel leader. Jesus wasn't rebelling against Rome, and yet he gets crucified as a rebel. Why is that? Because you and I are all rebels against God. We deserve to be crucified as rebels. But who gets crucified in our place? Jesus. As we look over at the insults that are being laid upon him, we can see precisely the opposite realities. Jesus' body as the temple being destroyed and raised up in 3 days is the reason that we are saved. It's because Jesus is the only true obedient Son of God that he won't come down off the cross. He stays on the cross not to save himself, but to save others. And he being on the cross is actually the evidence that he is the true King of Israel, promised all the way back in Psalm 22. And unless we can come to this point and acknowledge this aspect of Jesus' kingship, we will never be able to be people of the suffering king. We will never be able to look like servants of King Jesus instead of servants of Caesar. I want to finish off by just looking at 3 groups of people that I think are representative of 3 ways that we can come and approach Jesus as our saving king. The first group of people are the crowds that we see. They were in Jerusalem. They were there for Passover. Many of them probably didn't even really fully understand who Jesus was or why he was being crucified. They just got caught up in the moment, and they come and they heap insults on him. And they would represent what I call ignorant sinners. There are those of us who are, we know some stuff about Jesus, but we don't have the full picture. And because we don't have the full picture, we kind of ignore him. We push him to the side. We think, that's just for those people over there. And maybe some of you are in this category where you've been kind of dragged out to church, or you're watching online because someone's like, hey, check this out. And you're like, I don't know about this Jesus stuff. And you've never really dove into what he has to offer. But the reality is you know that life is more than what you're seeing right in front of you. You know that there's more to it. But the way that you've been going about it is trying to figure it out on your own. You've been trying to construct your own way. On the cross, Jesus comes to you. He pursues you. And he's coming to you and he's telling you, I am the way. I am the truth. And I am the life. I'm the one who's going to show you the way to the Father. His invitation for those of you who don't know him is to say, I'm actually coming to know you. I'm standing at your door and knocking. Will you let me in? The second group of people that we see is the chief priests and the teachers of the law, the elders of the people, and they would represent what I would call religious sinners. And many of us in part of this church, and I would include myself in this, probably often fall into this category. Religious sinners, they come to Jesus and they say, you know what, Jesus, I don't actually need you to save me. I'm doing pretty good on my own. Like, I've got my list, and I'm checking the boxes, and I've checked it twice, and I've figured out who's naughty or nice, and I'm nice. I'm good to go, Jesus. I don't need you to die for me. I'm pretty good. And here's where Jesus wants to come and confront our hearts. See, Jesus on the cross is telling us that you are far more needy than you know. I had to die because of you. Your good works are even a means by which you are acting in rebellion against me because you are simply telling me you don't need me. I'm the one who created you. So the invitation for those of us who encounter our saving King as religious sinners is an invitation to humility. To come to him as needy. To come to him and say, we can't do this on our own. We can't achieve what needs to be achieved. And it's through this humbling that Jesus is actually able to turn us into the people who can suffer and lay down our lives as servants of his kingdom. The final group of people that we see are the rebels who are crucified beside Jesus. And Matthew records both of them simply mocking Jesus. He doesn't even record their words. And I believe that the rebels did that because they had nothing left to lose. They thought, we're done. One of the other gospel writers actually records a conversation that happens with the rebels. One of them tells the other one, Jesus didn't do anything wrong, but we're here because we deserved it. And they would represent what I call condemned sinners. And there are some of us who you're here this morning and you think you're too far gone. Like this Jesus, this is great, but he doesn't know what I've done. He can't forgive me. Doesn't matter what he's done. It's not going to fix what I've done. And Jesus on the cross is coming to those of us who are living under this condemnation. And he's saying, it's finished. Your sins are paid for. As far as the east is from the west, that is how far I have removed your sin from you. And when we encounter that deep love of Jesus who accepts us who has paid for us, the gratitude that wells up in our hearts becomes the motivation by which we can then become the type of people who can't help but suffer for the sake of others, who can't help but lay down our lives because we've had this rich picture of Jesus who has already laid down his life for us. But unless you and I encounter Jesus, no matter what place we are coming from, as our saving King, we'll never be able to serve him as our suffering King. We'll never be able to join in his kingdom. We'll always fall into the temptation to live under the lordship of Caesar. So I want to invite us as we finish off this morning to come to our saving King, the one who suffered on the cross for us. And as we do so, allow him to work through us, evaluate our lives, hold them up to his, and ask, does my life reveal his kingship? Or does it look like that of Caesar?